Years ago, my family knew a police officer back when I was a kid. We'll call him Rob. We lived out in the country. It was mostly cattle land, pump jacks, and miles of unincorporated scrubland. Houses were sometimes miles apart, and the parched dirt and gravel roads went on forever. I think it was around Thanksgiving, and family and friends were hanging out in the backyard after dinner. Somehow the topic of weird stuff had come up, and our officer friend related the following. One night, Officer Rob got a call about a trespasser from one of our neighbors, an older man who lived alone in an old farmhouse. The old man said that a big, black man was messing around in the shed behind his house, so dispatch sent Rob out to investigate. He arrived at the house, and the old man was waiting for him out front. He reiterated that a huge black guy was creeping around in the back, and he thought the guy might be naked, but didn't know if he was armed or not. So Rob told the homeowner to stay out front, and he headed around the back to confront the intruder. He pulled out his flashlight and started shining it around the area. As he got closer to the backyard, he told us he started smelling something horrible like burning aluminum, but since we were out in the oil fields, he didn't really think anything of it. When the light fell across the shed, he saw the individual in question, a huge black figure silhouetted against the old wooden shed. At first, Rob also thought the intruder was naked, as all he saw was a huge, black, human-shaped form with broad shoulders and no visible shirt or clothing. The lower half was obscured by some sawhorses and other debris, so he couldn't see if the figure was wearing anything below the waist. He told us he called out to the individual, and it turned around to look at him. That was when he realized he wasn't looking at a human being. He said the thing was jet black like a shadow and completely featureless except for the eyes. The eyes were large, round, and glowed red like bicycle or driveway reflectors. He said he moved his hand to his firearm, and the thing turned and walked through the shed like a ghost, its right shoulder passing through the side of the shed as it walked away. When it got to the cinder block wall behind the shed at the edge of the property, it passed through that too. He said as the thing passed through the shed and then the wall, he heard an electric sound like a bug zapper each time. Shaken, he said he just stood there for a few moments, then backed away and returned to the front of the home. The old man mentioned that he had been getting worried since Rob had been gone for so long. When he asked what the old man was talking about, the homeowner told him he'd been gone almost 15 to 20 minutes. But to Rob, only a minute or two had passed. He told the homeowner he'd briefly seen someone, but they had run off into the woods and it was too dark to pursue them. Together, they went back to the shed, but nothing had been stolen or disturbed. Officer Rob told us he just made up a report about seeing a shirtless man and left it at that. He'd never told anyone on the force, but some of his friends knew the story. He said he was sick for days afterward and his face and hands became red and peeled like he'd been sunburned. He said no one else reported anything similar ever again. I remember the story because as I got older, I started getting interested in the paranormal. When I started reading about Mothman, I realized that Rob had seen something very similar. Everything started matching up from the smell to the electrical sounds to even the dried skin. I don't know what to make of it all, but it's weird as hell. I was a police officer for 4 years. Not really investigating, but I saw something strange. I was patrolling the neighborhoods one night on the graveyard shift, and at about 3 a.m., this weird fog rolled into town. The city is out in the desert southwest. The fog was really dense, and I could only see about 10 feet in front of me, so I decided to go back to the station to wait it out and finish my reports. As I was leaving the subdivision, I turned down a street where there had been a major traffic fatality about a year prior. A woman had been ejected from her vehicle after losing control at around 80 miles per hour. As I reached the spot where the accident happened, I saw a woman standing in the median with a yellow silhouette. I was like, WTF? And immediately tried to catch a glimpse of this person with my spotlight, but couldn't see anyone there. However, I did see the yellow silhouette move across the street in my rearview mirror. I rushed to turn the patrol car around and tried to catch up with her, but soon saw the yellow silhouette disappear, heading towards the desert. I figured there might be tractor trailers parked along the side of the road and that a driver was getting ready to leave. But as I reached the spot where I last saw the yellow silhouette, there was nothing there. I sat there in silence for what seemed like 30 minutes with the amber lights on. Soon, I saw the yellow silhouette again, moving fast through the desert, away from me and then back towards me. As this yellow silhouette began to move towards me, I immediately noticed the small memorial that had been placed in her honor in front of the patrol car. Some yellow solar lights at the memorial began to flicker, and I noped the fuck out of there. For the rest of my time there, while working the graveyard shift, I did not pass through that section of the roadway between 2:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. Police officer here. 3 years ago, living in CO, the station got a call about a ghost in someone's house. I wasn't the one on the phone, but apparently the person was hysterical and hard to understand. I arrived on the scene, and this woman of about 40 was standing in her front yard. The house is upper middle class and pretty bland. She swears there is a ghost inside. The only reason we didn't disregard the call is because she claimed there was screaming in her attic. She claimed the ghost was doing it, and I was supposed to make sure an animal wasn't stuck up there or something. She explained she had been hearing this screaming and bumping on the walls for the past 2 days. She is the only one who lives there with no pets who could cause it, and her neighbors were on vacation. So, of course, the logical explanation is a ghost. She was far too afraid to check the attic, so I headed up there. It was full of cobwebs and musty, and of course, the only light bulb didn't work. I took a step, and all of a sudden I heard banging and muffled yelling. Navigating with my flashlight, I headed over to the source, a corner in the far back. There was a hobo there. His leg had fallen through the floor and was stuck, and he couldn't get out. He started crying tears of joy when I walked over, thanking me and asking for help simultaneously. I pulled him out, trying to scratch his leg as little as possible, and led him outside after letting him stop and get some water. He told me he was just looking for a place to spend the night, and I felt like he had gotten punished enough for his trespass. I asked if he needed anything else before I sent him on his way. This happened about 3 or 4 years ago. We responded to alarms at all the district county city buildings. This particular building was a daycare and administration building for children and family services. To set the scene, it was late fall and we had a storm from hell going on, so naturally we had a bunch of alarms going off all over the city from the high winds, rain, etc. Normally, a call like this is a two-man affair at the least, but we had been experiencing a multitude of alarms going off, so my sergeant went to this one alone. Once on the scene and at the alarm box, he noticed that the alarms had been tripped as if someone entered from an outside door and walked/ran down the main hall. He called for an additional unit, and my partner and I responded. So we enter this building, and we all have that vibe. Some shit ain't right. As we start walking down the hall, we hear footsteps that sound like a child running down a hall. At first, we thought a child had possibly crawled into a cubby, fell asleep, and was roaming around. We announced ourselves and went down this dead-end hall where we heard the footsteps coming from, checking all the rooms along the way. My partner had just cleared a bathroom, and we were walking past to the next set of offices when we heard a child's laugh come from behind us. All 3 of us heard it. At this point, the hair on my neck stands up, and we turn around to recheck a few rooms. My sergeant contacted CFS administration to see if there was a report of a missing child and all that jazz. Nothing. 2 more times, we heard footsteps and laughing. We stayed together and checked the entirety of that building, and then separated to make sure the child wasn't slipping past us while we searched. Still nothing. At this point, I just wanted to nope the fuck out, so our sergeant called it clear, we reset the alarm, and it wasn't tripped again all night. We agreed not to mention all of us hearing the same shit. Hated going into the building forever after. I'm a police officer, and this one happened to my current partner shortly before I was hired. One evening, a woman went outside the house to have a smoke because she couldn't sleep. While in the backyard, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the basement through the window. She got closer and saw a young white male wearing a big dark jacket, blue jeans, and a winter hat with a palm on the top. She threw her cigarette and ran back into the house, locked the basement door, and then ran to her children's room and called the police. The call came across as a burglary in progress, so police flooded the area, set up a perimeter, and then made entry into the home and the basement to find nothing. No one was in the home, and the basement door was still locked. This woman was not intoxicated, was not a drug user, and was absolutely sure of what she saw. She took her kids and went to stay at her brother's house in the next town over. Police were all cleared because there was no suspect and no crime. Fast forward a few months later, one of the officers told the story to his father, who's retired from the department, and his father informed him of a suicide that took place in the basement of that house in the mid-'80s. He then described the kid as having hanged himself in the basement and then described the clothing the kid was wearing when found. It matched the woman's description from that evening perfectly, right down to the winter hat with a palm on it. Checked the records for the property, and the woman who owns the house moved in the early 2000s. It's pretty safe to say she had no idea of the history of the house, and I fully believe she saw a ghost that night. So, this story is going to be a bit ridiculous and maybe a bit long. Read if you like that sort of thing or if you're bored. A mate of mine is a DI, we'll call him Dave for now, and he was staying at my place for a few weeks after his neighbor managed to saw off the main gas pipe in their building, which is how I got involved. Early one morning in October, around 3:50 a.m., he gets called in for, and I quote, assisting in a weird situation. This was during a busy season, so they were short on on-duty officers. It was all hands on deck, basically. He asked me to come along for, in his words, mental support. I've tagged along before a few times in my role as photographer, and I sometimes help out on crowded days because I've got a first aid license and training in martial arts and crowd control. We got there, and the poor lady was completely freaked out. After 3 cups of tea, the story came out. The gist of it was that the 90-year-old lady thought her grandson was possessed by a demon. Yep, you read that right. 21st century Western Europe, and the woman believes in demons. If you're an atheist, like us, you can probably imagine the look Dave and I shared at that. The neighbor stayed with the lady while the only other officer briefed Dave. Apparently, the woman was visiting her grandson in the city and had heard the lad, 17 years old, making really strange shouting and thumping noises all night. In sheer panic, she'd barricaded the door. She swore it wasn't his girlfriend because she didn't hear a woman's voice. By now, I think you can guess where this is going. We certainly could. We're still not sure how she got from weird noises to demon, but some questions are best left unasked. He added that the neighbor mentioned the woman was in the 3rd stage of Alzheimer's, was a very devout Catholic, and wasn't capable of thinking straight. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, so I know up close what it's like. The neighbor was correct, so the officer stayed with the woman, and Dave and I went upstairs. We were halfway through moving aside the impressive pile of furniture in front of the door when the woman ran up the stairs in sheer panic, screeching at us not to open the door. She kept going on about calling a priest for an exorcism and signs of evil and whatnot. Dave, in what I can only assume to be an ever-expanding headache, helpfully piped up, "There's no need for that, ma'am. We've brought our own expert. She's done several exorcisms." I'll blame it on the early hours of the morning. It was 4:30, but it took me a full 8 seconds to realize he meant me. The lady, apparently having a very rare faith in police officers, believed him straight away. Dave had the officer take the lady back to the kitchen, turned to me and said, "I hope you have an idea. I'd rather not call the paramedics to take her to a psychiatric facility." Then he turned, walked to the door, and called out to the lad that it's the police. 2 voices answered. "Demon? No." "The lad's boyfriend?" "Yep." "Good luck explaining that one to your incredibly devout gran." So Dave gave me a look and told the lads to hang tight, we'd handle this. By now, the nerd in me was awake enough to come up with an, in hindsight, rather hilarious idea. So Dave told the boys to play along. We went downstairs, asked the lady for a bottle of water and a jar of salt, and told her to come with me but wait on the stairs behind the line of salt I drew on the floor. The only way to convince her was to let her see and hear our little theatrics. I muttered some rubbish over the bottle, the lyrics to the Elven version of "I Am the One" from Dragon Age Origins, if you're curious, passed it to Dave, and told him to throw it at anything that tries to charge at us. So he put on his best authoritative voice, yelled, "Police! In the name of all that's holy, open this door," and charged in when it opened in typical police fashion. One of the lads looked a bit miffed, the other on the verge of hysterical giggles. I yelled out a string of vague pseudo-Latin that had Dave staring at me as if I'd grown a second head, and flashed the flashlight on my phone a few times for effect. Dave stomped grudgingly on the floor for a bit after I gestured to him. All done, Dave motioned for the boyfriend to wait while we brought the grandson downstairs. In the hallway, his gran stared at him, hugged him, and headed back downstairs. Dave and I followed her into the kitchen, and the other officer helped the boyfriend sneak out of the house. The woman flung her arms around my neck, shouted, "Bless you, miss," and then did the same to Dave. As we left, Dave suggested to the lad that maybe permanent residence in a care home for his grandmother might be a better idea. By 6:30, we were finally outside, and it was absolutely pouring rain. We jumped in his car, and he asked, "So, let's hear it. What the hell was that? And what the hell did you say?" The only thing I could reply after that weird an evening was, "Mate, I binge-watched Supernatural for the 8th time last week, and what I didn't remember from the words of the ritual in there, I filled in with lorem ipsum." He snickered, started the car, and then burst out laughing. Between his hysterical giggles, he barely managed to choke out, "Happy Halloween." I was on campus at a university when there was a complaint about someone slamming doors in one of the buildings. Keep in mind, the buildings are closed except for professors and faculty, and it's around 10 p.m. Shortly after arriving at the person who had called, sure enough, I shit you not, it sounded like someone was pounding on a door. I called for assistance thinking someone had snuck in and waited. While waiting, we heard the pounding again, sounding like it was coming from the stairwell. Once my partner arrived, we walked down the very long, narrow hallway, looking in every classroom and checking the doors. Every door was locked and shut, and there was nothing in the classrooms. We proceeded to check the stairwells and found absolutely nobody or anything residing in the stairwells. We relocked all the doors, and on our way out, we heard one creak open. Sure enough, the door in the stairwell was open after being secured shut. We noped right the fuck out of there, got back to base, and watched the cameras. Clear as day, the door opened right after we turned the corner. I refused to go there at night without another person with me. There was no answer at all for why it happened. Ever since then, we've received calls asking us to investigate some banging and whatnot at that same building, but no answers. I was never a believer in the paranormal until that shit. Not exactly supernatural, but very creepy at first, and ultimately really sad. I was on night shift in an isolated Northern Canadian First Nations community, investigating a possible late-night domestic violence complaint. It was the middle of winter, and it was freezing while my partner and I got out of our vehicle to try and find the residence where the neighbors heard a woman scream. Now, the houses on a lot of reservations are not well numbered, and our caller couldn't say for sure which house the scream came from. So we were wandering around like dummies when we heard an ear-splitting shriek come from the house directly in front of us. We hurried up to the door of the single-story prefab home, and I noticed all the lights were off. Nothing more could be heard from inside, but the front door was ajar. We knocked on the door and yelled, "Police!" through the opening in the door a few times. Nothing. So, fearing for the safety of whoever had just screamed, we slowly opened the door and announced ourselves again. Still nothing. Slowly, we walked into the house, careful to step over the garbage and kids' toys that were all over the floor. The home was very poorly maintained. I was worried I might trip over a body buried in the trash. The house was as pitch black as the night outside, so we had our flashlights out. I panned my flashlight to the left, seeing just more nothing and more garbage. Then I panned it to the right, and the light reflected on something white. I snapped the light back and fixed it on a small girl, maybe 10 years old, about 10 feet away. She was wearing a knee-length white sleeping gown, the type that went out of style with your great-grandmother. The gown was dirty and stained and likely ancient. The girl's head was slumped forward, but she was still standing, with greasy hair covering her face. She looked like the girl from the movie The Ring. I was expecting to see a static-filled TV behind her. I tried to talk to the girl, but she didn't move, didn't talk. She just wobbled slightly in place. I tried to take a step toward her, and her head jerked up. She locked eyes with me and screamed her lungs out. Let's say it was startling and leave it at that. The girl then hung her head low again, ignoring me. Okay, so I'd like to say something cool and supernatural happened, but it didn't. Eventually, we were man enough to approach her. She ran into a back bedroom where a boy half her age was sleeping. Took far too much effort to wake the boy, which was worrying. The boy was able to tell us his dad's name while the girl in white sat on the bed. Eventually, Dad came home once we were able to call him. He was working the night shift and had left his alcoholic wife with the kids. The wife had gone off drinking and, I suspect, may have drugged the boy to make him fall asleep. There was no adult left to care for the siblings. The girl, it turns out, had severe autism and couldn't speak. She could only yell. We investigated, got local child welfare involved, and forwarded charges. Nothing happened. Everything was ignored. I'm in Canada after all. I wish it was the girl from the movie. I'd have finished my shift with a better opinion of the world than I did. I'm sorry there are no real ghosts in the story. Alright, so the story goes there's this one road that is haunted through and through. Thankfully, it's just outside of my city. Anyway, back in the day, like 50 or so years ago, I guess this woman was riding in a car with a male hitchhiker who directed her down this road. It's paved, with several houses close to the main road it turns off from. However, as you get further and further down, the trees get denser, the road turns to dirt, and nothing is out there. Halfway along the road is a small wooden bridge with a creek or some water underneath. The hitchhiker made her pull over and either had another buddy waiting at the bridge or he had been hitchhiking too, depending on who tells the story. They got her out, raped her, and murdered her. So many stories stem from that road, and if you Google the name, there are tons of websites with their own accounts of spookings. I've never been down that road, but I do partially believe in hauntings and ghosts. I'm on night shift and cruising around, and as I pass this road, all you can see is a thick layer of fog down the road. It was like a wall of fog and never came out to the main street. I noped the fuck out of that area.